thanks to the British for reviving Sanskrit and Brahmi script languages and teaching to Indians. Sanskrit's transition from a commonly spoken language to a specialized language of scholarship, religion, and literature occurred over a long period of time. It's difficult to pinpoint an exact duration for this transition, as it varied across regions and historical contexts. Sanskrit's evolution can be broadly divided into different periods. 1. Vedic period. Sanskrit was spoken and used in ancient religious rituals during the Vedic period around 1500 to 600 BCE. This is considered the earliest stage of the language. 2. Classical period. Sanskrit evolved and developed as a literary and cultural language during the classical period around 600 BCE to 1100 CE. It was used for composing religious texts, philosophical treatises, literature, and scientific works. 3. Medieval period. As regional languages gained prominence and Sanskrit's role shifted to scholarly and religious domains, it gradually ceased to be a common spoken language. By the medieval period, roughly 8th to 12th centuries CE, it was predominantly used by scholars, priests, and intellectuals. 4. Colonial and modern periods. During the colonial period 18th to 20th centuries CE, Sanskrit continued to be studied by scholars and remained relevant for religious and scholarly purposes. However, it was no longer a widely spoken language. Since the medieval period, Sanskrit's use as a common spoken language had significantly declined. By the time of British colonial rule, it was largely confined to scholarly and religious contexts. Its influence continued through its use in religious rituals, classical literature, and academic study. In summary, Sanskrit's use as a common language declined over centuries, and by the medieval period, it was no longer a language commonly spoken by the general population. Its transition into a specialized language of scholarship and religious tradition was a gradual process that unfolded over many centuries. It's challenging to provide an exact number of how many Indians knew Sanskrit by the year 1757, as comprehensive census data from that time period is not available. However, it's important to note that by 1757, Sanskrit had already transitioned from being a commonly spoken language to a more specialized language of scholarship, religious texts, and literature. During the 18th century, Sanskrit was primarily used by scholars, priests, and individuals involved in religious and academic pursuits. It was not widely spoken as a conversational language among the general population. Knowledge of Sanskrit would have been concentrated among a relatively small segment of the Indian population, particularly those who were engaged in religious studies, traditional education, and scholarly endeavors. The British colonial period, which began in the late 18th century, further shifted the linguistic landscape of India. English became the language of administration and education under British rule, and regional languages continued to be spoken more widely by the common people. In summary, by 1757, Sanskrit had transitioned from a commonly spoken language to a specialized language of scholarship and religious texts. Its usage was limited to a relatively small number of individuals who were actively engaged in scholarly and religious activities. It's reasonable to assume that Sanskrit usage would have been limited to a relatively small percentage of the population in 1757. Given the historical context and the transition of Sanskrit from a commonly spoken language to a more specialized language of scholarship, religion, and literature, it's likely that the percentage of people who actively used Sanskrit would have been lower than the overall literacy rate. While it's challenging to provide an exact percentage, it's plausible that Sanskrit usage could have been below 1% of the population. The usage of Sanskrit by that time was concentrated among scholars, priests, religious institutions, and individuals involved in traditional education and intellectual pursuits. As you mentioned, with a literacy rate of around 3%, the majority of the population would not have been proficient in reading or using Sanskrit. The linguistic landscape during this period was diverse, with various regional languages being more commonly spoken by the general population. In summary, while Sanskrit was still valued for its significance in religious and scholarly contexts, its usage was limited to a small segment of the population, likely less than 1%, by 1757. During British colonial rule in India, which began in the late 18th century and continued into the 20th century, there was a renewed interest in Sanskrit as a language of knowledge and cultural heritage. While the British administration promoted the use of English for administrative and educational purposes, they also recognized the value of Sanskrit for various reasons. 1. Historical and cultural interest. British scholars and administrators were intrigued by India's rich cultural and intellectual heritage, and Sanskrit texts were considered valuable historical and religious documents. 2. Linguistic studies. British linguists were interested in Sanskrit as a language with complex grammar and structure. Studying Sanskrit was believed to provide insights into the origins of languages and linguistics. 3. Ancient texts and knowledge. Many classical Indian texts, including religious scriptures, epics, and philosophical treatises, were written in Sanskrit. British scholars wanted to understand and translate these texts for academic and intellectual purposes. 4. Educational and academic pursuits. The establishment of colleges and universities during the colonial period led to the inclusion of Sanskrit in the curriculum. Sanskrit was taught alongside other languages and subjects. As a result of these factors, British scholars and institutions played a role in the preservation, study, and revival of Sanskrit. They set up Orientalist departments in universities, published translations of Sanskrit texts, and supported the study of Indian languages, including Sanskrit. However, it's important to note that the British interest in Sanskrit was often driven by academic and administrative motivations. The British were primarily interested in the language for its historical and intellectual value rather than its cultural or religious significance to the Indian population. In summary, the British colonial period saw a renewed interest in Sanskrit as a language of knowledge and cultural heritage, leading to its preservation, study, and inclusion in educational institutions. The British colonial period in India played a significant role in deciphering the Brahmi script and contributing to the understanding of ancient Indian inscriptions and texts. Here's an overview of how this process unfolded. 1. Discovery of inscriptions. British administrators, scholars, and explorers in India during the colonial period discovered numerous inscriptions on rocks, pillars, caves, and other structures. These inscriptions were written in scripts that were unfamiliar to them. 2. Efforts to decipher scripts. The discovery of inscriptions in various scripts, including Brahmi, raised curiosity among British scholars. They recognized the importance of deciphering these scripts to understand the historical and cultural context of ancient India. 3. James Prinsep's contributions. James Prinsep, a British scholar and numismatist, made significant contributions to the decipherment of Brahmi script. He successfully deciphered inscriptions on ancient Indian coins, which led to the identification of letters and words. Prinsep's work paved the way for further studies in Indian epigraphy. 4. Collaboration with Indian scholars. British scholars collaborated with Indian scholars and experts in Sanskrit and ancient Indian languages. This collaboration was essential for cross-referencing deciphered inscriptions with known languages and texts. 5. Publication of inscriptions. The deciphered inscriptions were published in various scholarly journals and books. This dissemination of knowledge helped build a foundation for understanding ancient Indian history and culture. 6. Impact on education. The decipherment of Brahmi script and the understanding of ancient Indian inscriptions had an impact on education and curriculum. Brahmi script and epigraphy were taught in universities and academic institutions to provide students with insights into India's historical past. 7. Archaeological surveys. The British colonial administration conducted archaeological surveys, leading to the discovery of more inscriptions and ancient sites. These discoveries further enrich the understanding of ancient India. 8. Translation and publication. British scholars translated and published inscriptions, making them accessible to a wider audience. This dissemination of knowledge contributed to the understanding of India's history and culture. 9. Preservation of heritage. The efforts to decipher and understand the Brahmi script also led to a greater awareness of the need to preserve India's historical and cultural heritage. The British administration and scholars took measures to protect and document ancient monuments and inscriptions. While the British colonial period played a role in deciphering the Brahmi script and contributing to the study of ancient Indian inscriptions, it's important to acknowledge the contributions of Indian scholars, linguists, and epigraphists who collaborated with British scholars. The decipherment of the Brahmi script was a collective effort that combined British expertise with local knowledge and insights.